Good morning, everybody, or good afternoon if you are in a later time zone. Welcome to the fourth of our 5-part podcasting workshop series. This one's going to be focused on how to put your podcast out into the world. I'm Pam Lach. I'm the Digital Humanities Librarian here at San Diego State. I use she, her pronouns, and I'm joined by my colleague, Patrick Flanagan, who is the DH Center Programs and Operations Specialist. And he'll be here to answer questions, keep an eye on the chat, make sure that I'm not skipping over anything. Before we get started, I'm going to read the San Diego State land acknowledgement. For millennia, the Kumeyaay people have been a part of this land. This land has nourished, healed, protected, and embraced them for many generations in a relationship of balance and harmony. As members of the San Diego State community, we acknowledge this legacy. We promote this balance and harmony. We find inspiration from this land, the land of the Kumeyaay. And I also want to acknowledge that this virtual workshop wouldn't be possible without several tools, including Zoom, which is headquartered on the traditional lands of the Ohlone and Tamian people in what we now call San Jose, California, as well as we rely heavily on Google and Google Drive, which is based on the traditional lands of the Tamian Nation, the Ohlone, the Ramaytush, the Muwekma peoples in what we now call Mountain View, California. These technologies, which allow us to connect across vast distances, are not without their invisible costs, both in terms of human labor and environmental impact. And as you've heard me say before, land acknowledgement is not a corrective for past, current, and future violence and injustice. It's a starting place and a call to action. So I invite y'all to think about the ways that you can engage in thoughtful action to right past wrongs and current injustices. All right. As I said, this is the fourth of our 5-part workshop series. We're getting close to the finish line. And all of the links for the work, all of the content, I should say, for the workshop live at that tiny URL. For those of you who aren't able to join us in real time, we also post our videos up on our DH Initiative YouTube channel, and that link is also in the chat. It takes me a little bit of time to process the video, and I try to do a rough cleaning of the transcript before I put it up on YouTube. So it's typically posted by the next week. And so you can always go back over anything you missed or review anything that you want to hear again. And again, as a reminder, we've got lots of resources in that Google Drive folder, all the slides that you're welcome to copy to your Google Drive or download. If you downloaded the slides at the beginning of the workshop series, you might want to update the download because I've been updating the slides before each workshop as I think of additional things. We've also got tip sheets, sort of quick FAQs to get you started, longer training videos if you want to do a deeper dive, and then sample audio to play with. And there's a podcasting resources overview document that sort of gives you a snapshot of all of the resources, including a spec sheet if you're looking to build your own studio wherever you are. And many of you have heard me say this already, but what we're doing over these 5 weeks is based on a more immersive and intense workshop series that or institute that we run with the National Humanities Center. Excuse me. It's a week-long virtual institute that we run in the winter for graduate students in the humanities and humanistic social sciences, and in the summer for faculty, librarians, academic staff, and independent scholars. Our winter institute registration site is open, and there are still spots available. So if you are in a position to institutionally sponsor a student, that is to pay for a student to attend, check out that link, and we encourage you to explore it or reach out to me if you have any questions. Okay, so what we're going to be doing together today, we're going to talk about all the little pieces that you need to think about once you're done with post-production and are ready to put your podcast out into the world. And really, ideally, you'll need to think about these things before you start your podcast because you need to sort of have a plan in place for where your podcast is going to live on the web. There's lots of links in here and on the corresponding tip sheet and a lot of things to think about. So we're going to try to keep it a little bit simple and make sure that we're covering all the bases, but particularly different options for hosting your podcast with what we call the RSS capability. And we'll talk about the RSS feed a little bit today. You'll need cover art, both for the show and then for episodes. You'll need transcripts, show notes, and thinking of ways to promote your podcast. And we'll be talking quite a bit about that as well. Before we dive into any of that, I wanted to just see if there was any questions lingering from any of the first 4 workshops. We were a little pressed for time last week with the editing. It's a little hard to do editing in an hour. And so if there's any questions that you have or things that you want to know more about, we can take a few minutes now before we dive into this workshop. And you can put them in chat or raise your hand and unmute if you don't mind being part of the video that goes up on YouTube. And I'll just give it a moment to see. Okay, I'm not seeing anything, so I might keep going. And we might be able to end early today, and we can always circle back to these kinds of questions throughout the hour. Okay, let's talk about the wild world of hosting podcasts. The way that people listen to podcasts varies from person to person. It can be highly individualized. And so one of the common ways that people will listen to podcasts is that they will download some sort of podcasting app to their device and then subscribe to shows. And when they subscribe to a show, new episodes get pushed to the app on their device. And if you think about this, or how you might engage with podcasting, or listen to podcasts, I should say, Apple Podcasts is one of the most popular ways that people do this. That's how I get my podcasts. And I think it's one of the oldest forms of services for podcasting. There's Google Podcasts, which I heard recently might be shutting down. I'm not sure. But there's other apps devoted to this: Stitcher, Pocket Casts, all sorts of things. And then in more recent years, Spotify, Amazon, and Audible have gotten into the podcast game. And so while the podcasts are still free and the apps are still free, we're starting to see some paywalls for some podcasts or for additional content, which we'll talk about later. Other folks will go to the podcast website and listen in their browser. And back in 2019, when we first ran our pilot podcasting institute, we had someone from the local NPR affiliate who runs the podcast program for the NPR affiliate. She came and talked to us, and she actually said that a high percentage of their listeners just went to their website and listened to audio that way. That was back in 2019. I'm not sure how much that's shifted. And I actually wonder if it's a combination of things, depending on where a listener is and what they're doing. If I'm at work, I might listen directly through the browser on a website. If I'm on the go, I might listen on my phone. And so it might be a combination of things. And so it gets really complicated as we see more and more podcasting apps and services out there. It gets more and more complicated to think about where you want your podcast to live. But no matter what choice you make, your podcast now needs to be somewhere out on the web. And if you want it to be discoverable on these various apps, you're going to need what's called an RSS feed. And I'll talk about that in just a moment. There are people who choose not to do that and just have their podcast on a website and direct traffic to their website and hope that people will listen in their browser or on their phones. But the vast majority will use one of these hosting sites to push their podcasts out into the various services and apps. And there's a lot of hosting services out there. So basically, a podcast hosting service is a platform where you can do all of your where you can host your podcast. Some of these platforms also offer tools for recording and editing. and other tools like market analysis, audience segmentation, monetization, and additional content. So for people who are trying to make a living as podcasters, they need to rely on some of these tools. For some of us who are doing more maybe niche scholarly podcasting, we might not care about things like audience segmentation or monetization or things like that. But we still, these are the platforms available to us. Many of them cost money. Many have a free entry-level subscription with limits, like it limits the number of audio files you can upload or the amount of the length of the audio files or something like that. Back in the day, not so long ago, I typically would send people over to anchor.fm, which was a really good free platform for people getting started. The one caveat with Anchor was that you could only have one show. So if you wanted to have two different unrelated podcasts, you had to create two separate accounts using two separate emails. But that was a decent workaround, and Anchor was sort of working on a solution. And then Spotify purchased Anchor. And now Spotify has Spotify for Podcasters, which, to the best of my knowledge, I think is free. They're trying to push people to their more paid platforms, but there is, I think, a free version. And then the beauty of that is not only will your podcast live in Spotify, which you might, is good and bad in that Spotify is a problematic platform, but it also pushes your podcast out to all of these other sites. But there are other ones out there like Buzzsprout, Podbean, RSS.com. The pricing structure is different depending on the platform. So Buzzsprout charges essentially, there are tiers based on how many hours a month of content you're going to put out there. So if you're going to release an episode a week and it's going to be, each episode is an hour, the entry level subscription won't be enough for you. And they also add all these little extras. So like Apple Podcasts uses a slightly different kind of process for pushing podcasts. And so you have to pay extra to get integration into Apple. Back in the day, Anchor.fm did not push to Apple. Now Spotify for Podcasters does. And so there's all these little things that you have to think about. Now, a lot of folks also create a standalone website where they have a sort of standing presence. They can embed the podcast in the website so people could listen directly in the website. And then they also link out to their the various places where people get their podcasts. So for instance, I have to exit out of here for just a second. Radiolab, interestingly, this is their standalone website. And you can listen directly in the browser, but you can also go find the podcast on any of these apps. And you can see there's like a dozen of them. And so this allows a one-stop shop for all the podcasts and also helps you find them in whatever app you're in. And the website is a really great way, a great wrapper for your podcast, particularly if you have additional content. And we'll talk about that throughout this hour. When we first launched the Institute with the National Humanities Center, we actually had teams build a website using the Humanities Commons open platform and then embed their podcast into their website. Humanities Commons runs on WordPress, and there are widgets in most of these content management systems that allow you to embed whatever audio you have into a nice little sort of widget. And in fact, let me exit out again. That's what I've done here. This is the Podcast Institute website. And what I do is when people release their podcasts, only the ones who want to share it publicly, I'll embed it using just the HTML embed code that the hosting service provides. So you can listen in the website, or you can go link out to the actual podcast. And so that it looks a little different depending on what platform you're using, but essentially I'm just embedding that audio that lives elsewhere. And then we can have additional content in that website. So those are the sort of two main ways that people do it. Some people just rely on the hosting platform. Yes, and Zoe reminds us that if you use the Humanities Commons repository, you can get a DOI for each one. And it's awesome that you work for HCommons and that you're promoting it. I use HCommons a lot. It's a really wonderful tool for humanities scholars, and not just humanities scholars, but scholars in general. So some people just use whatever platform they're on and they don't have additional content. But for folks who anticipate additional content, having a standalone website is a great way to go. And I think for scholarly podcasting in particular, that is a really great way to go. A lot of people are starting to use Patreon as well. And Patrick, I know, listens to a really popular podcast where he pays extra through Patreon to get the extra content. And so there's lots of different options out there. And that's part of the challenge of figuring out how to get your podcast into the world. There are almost too many options out there. So it's hard to make choices. Oh yeah, Angela, go ahead.
Hey, I may have missed following something. So I'm looking at the podcast hosting and the website. So you should, it sounds like you have your podcast hosted somewhere and then you embed that hosting onto your website. Or is it, if you have a website where you can put your recording, there's a way to be able to push that RSS feed onto these searches without using one of the podcast hosting services?
That's a great question. And we're going to cover that in just a moment. Generally, you're going to need some sort of audio hosting site, because if you don't do that, you're going to have to manually push out your podcast to all the different platforms. Back in the day when there were only a few platforms, it wasn't as big of a deal. But you do need a site that serves audio for seamless listening, right? So it needs the buffering and the streaming capability. And so you can do it with your audio just sort of directly embedded in your website, but then it won't be able to talk to the other platforms. And so there are people who choose to do that. And again, it's going to depend on what it is you're trying to do. So just a couple caveats before we proceed with that. And it is very confusing because there's a lot of different options. If you think you're going to have multiple different unrelated shows or a lot of episodes, or you anticipate getting really big really fast, you have to be careful. A lot of these free plans that are sort of to get you started have a lot of limitations. They limit the number of shows you can have or the number of episodes. Some of them limit the number of audience members. So, and then alternatively, paid services can get very expensive depending on what you're looking for. So transistor.fm claims to be the best option for hosting multiple shows. So let's say you have one about book project number one about book project number 2, one for book project number 3, and you want them to be standalone podcasts. A lot of platforms say they do this, but they'll charge you extra. Transistor does do this, but their price points depend on your audience. So if you are hoping to make it really big, you have to think about that. There are lots of good resources out there that compare and benchmark different hosting options. The bottom line is that you need to do that backwards design that we talked about in the first workshop to kind of figure out what is it you're trying to do, how big of an audience do you want, and what's the best way to reach them. If you think your audience primarily is listening on Apple Podcasts, then maybe you just focus on that. If you think they're listening in the browser, maybe you just focus on a website and have your audio embedded and not worry about pushing out to all the platforms. If you anticipate having additional content beyond just the audio, you'll need to think about that and whether these hosting platforms allow you to do that or whether you'll need that standalone website. And then thinking about the life cycle of your podcast. Many people will do a limited series, one season, only so many episodes. And I think particularly for scholarly podcasting and niche podcasting, it's a really lovely model. Rather than try to do everything, you just stick to a little bit. Maybe it's based on grant funding that you have, or maybe it's tied to a book project and you don't want to run it for multiple seasons. This can help you think of the kinds of solution you need, small, medium, or large. And as Patrick's reminding us, one of the things that basically what you really want to do is have a lot of options, especially if you're thinking of really committing resources, time, and energy into podcasting, where you have that website, you have it listing on, you have it posted on a hosting site, and you're pushing out across platforms. This can be hard to predict. And the thing that you want to try to avoid is having to shift solutions down the road. Now, if you have a standalone website, and you have to shift options of hosting sites, it's more seamless because you still have that standalone website, And as long as you're shifting from one hosting platform to another, you can continue pushing out your content. And a lot of these hosting sites make it really easy for you to shift. So like if you go to Spotify, they'll be like, already have a podcast? Bring it on board. And they want to make it really, really easy. The bottom line is the RSS feed. This is the critical piece that allows for what we would call the interoperability or the crosswalks from one site to another. For your website, your podcast to get pushed to multiple simultaneous platforms so that you can meet your audience wherever they listen to podcasts. So the RSS is a metadata model. And metadata is data about data. And what it does is it's an agreed upon standard of how we're going to describe content on the web. And all the sites sort of adhere to that same model. You put your audio in, it has associated metadata. So you upload it to your website. And then that metadata then starts talking to all these other platforms. So you put it in your website, you push it out simultaneously using that RSS feed to all the other platforms. And as more and more platforms come online, your hosting service will be talking to those platforms so that it just sort of magically will show up in someone's device. So it's a content aggregator that allows things to be exchanged from one site to another. For those of you who are familiar with the world of metadata, it's expressed as extensible markup language that, and I'll show you what that looks like for those who are new to XML. But XML is the way that we articulate the metadata, and we make sure that we're all using it in the same way so that one platform can read it, and there's no issues there. Keeping in mind that the Apple Podcast RSS functions somewhat or slightly differently. So essentially, when you upload a new episode, the hosting site will sort of walk you through filling out that metadata, and then it pushes through the RSS feed. And as long as someone has subscribed to your podcast on whatever platform, whether it's Apple, Stitcher, Pocket Cast, whatever, it will feed directly to their device. And the beauty of it now is that you don't have to hard code your XML. But for those who are curious about what XML looks like or what a XML podcast file looks like, this is an excerpt of one. And essentially, what we want to look for with XML is that it has a very particular structure with elements. These are the things in brackets that appear in green text. And then whatever's in between the brackets is your unique metadata for your file. And so you can see here, it's a fake show, just someone using it to show what that feed looks like. And again, these hosting platforms do this for you, but this is what it's going to look like on the back end. You don't have to use the RSS file. You don't have to look at the XML, but just so you know what's happening behind the scenes. So there are some people who want to do it themselves, and you can do it yourself. So you can set up your own website, and you can create your own RSS feed and manually push that feed out. It can be complicated. And again, because Apple is a little different, it's not a one-click kind of thing. If you want to do it this way, and I don't really recommend that you do it this way because it's much more complex than using a hosting service. But if you absolutely need to, you can do that. What you're going to have to do is validate your metadata before you push it out. And by validation, we mean it has to be well-formed. So it has to have all the elements in the right kind of order, and then it has to be sort of syntactically correct, and there have to be no errors in it. And there are XML RSS feed, podcast RSS feed validators out there where essentially you just submit your data, your metadata, and it checks it for you. And Apple and all of these different places will explain how they manage it. And so if you wanted to do it, you could actually hard code it. Again, I don't think it's necessarily the solution, especially for a short run podcast. If you're doing a short run podcast, likely you can use one of the free subscriptions. If you have grant funding, you can pay for that. You can keep it under $20 a month if you have the budget for that. There are free options if you don't. Again, Spotify for podcasters might be your best bet, and it does do that integration. And then if you want a website, you can go to HCommons. You can embed your audio directly in your website from Spotify for podcasters and still push it out to all the different platforms. Okay, any questions about that before we talk about cover art? Okay, I'm not seeing any, so I'm going to keep going. Oh, Martha, go ahead.
Yeah, sorry. I'm worried about archiving. Is someone archiving long-term access to some important podcasts and that decision making?
Yeah, that's a great question. I don't 100% know. And one of the issues with some of these services is that they can go belly up. So several years ago, SoundCloud nearly went bankrupt and everyone was really worried about the audio being lost. I highly recommend that you engage in your own archival practice if you're going to do a podcast. So if you're doing a scholarly podcast, you can deposit the audio file in a repository. H Commons, not only does it allow you to create a website, but as Zoe reminds us, it also has a repository where you can actually load content. I think it's called the core, but correct me if I'm wrong. It's been a second since I've been on H Commons. So you can put it in as a sort of standalone archival thing. You'll also want to save and archive all of your stuff in case there's a problem. So every so often, if you accidentally use copyrighted audio, the typical procedure in the past, at least, has been that someone would say, please take my audio out of that. You would have to go back to your original project file, remove that audio, that music, and remix with something else, and then repost it to your hosting site. So you need to save all of those files as well. And so you should always engage in your own kind of archival practices. But whether these hosting services are actually doing it or not, I don't know. And so, yeah. And Jacob asks about SoundCloud. SoundCloud is another option, and we do send folks to SoundCloud as well. Last I checked, it had a free version where you could have a certain number of hours free per month. And it also pushes out to the podcasting platforms. So a lot of our Institute participants do use SoundCloud to put their one episode up. If you want to launch a full-on show, you'll probably have to pay. And so it's very similar to all the other ones. And I do have some links to SoundCloud and other things. I just failed to mention it. So I don't recommend it. And I'm actually not recommending any of these insofar as I just want you to be aware of there are many options. Each has its strengths and its limitations. Many charge you for what you want, or the free version might not be enough for you. And we can't trust that they will engage in archiving and backing up your stuff. It's living out in the cloud, right? But as we talked about in the first workshop, we always want to have backups. You want to have your own things saved. If you're doing scholarly podcasting, definitely send it to some sort of repository, whether you have a research repository at your institution or you want to use the core repository through H Commons, which is an excellent repository, and I fully support that. So you want to have those sort of backups. And you might, you wouldn't want to put the full project file and the WAV file in the core H Commons core repository, maybe just the MP3, but you can also put the transcript in, you can put your show notes, your cover art, all that good stuff, and it can be sort of bundled as a thing. Any other questions about that before we move on? And I realize it's very overwhelming. There's so many options out there. You can always start with one and switch. So you can try out SoundCloud. Basically, a lot of our Institute participants will set up a SoundCloud account just for the week, and they do the free version, and then they just leave it there, and maybe they go on to another platform for an actual podcast that they launch. Yeah. Oh, so question about Spotify, and I don't want to get too political, but there's some issues with Spotify for a variety of reasons. Some are political in terms of what content they do or don't allow. Some of it relates to intellectual property with how artists get paid, and that's more on the music side. The thing that's really interesting is that Spotify has started to get into the podcasting game. And my concern about things like Spotify and Audible and Amazon trying to promote podcasting is that I fear that they're trying to create a paywall to get people to pay for podcasts when podcasts started as a completely free thing and very DIY. So more my concern is that they're trying to sort of, Spotify is making it, things like Spotify are making it so that you have to pay to podcast or to listen to podcasts. And that's my concern. And these hosting platforms do that as well, right? They make it easy for you. And so if you're a professional podcaster, you need to rely on these things. But if you're not a professional podcaster and you're doing a limited series, there are these other options. There's no perfect solution out there. And, we have to sort of think about that. And so, we here at the DH Center are struggling with that too. We've decided we want to have our own hosting platform for podcasts that get produced in the DH Center, or for podcasts that get produced at our institutes where people want to use our service rather than create their own account. And we've been researching this for quite some time, and we're really struggling to pick something because we can't predict what we want in 2 years. We have no idea. And also there are, values-based choices that we need to make. And what we'll do is we'll finally pick a solution and be transparent about why we picked that. So yeah, and I'm always happy to talk to y'all about this. I will say, and Patrick notes this in the chat, the podcast platform landscape is constantly evolving. When we first started running these institutes, there were far fewer services out there, and there are so many more now, and they each claim to be the best one, right? And so, it's tough. This part is sort of the hardest part when I help people launch a podcast, of like making those choices. And again, it's about figuring out, what it is that you think you want to do and trying to get a little bit of a crystal ball and anticipate what you might want to do down the road and try to pick the solution that best meets your needs at that moment with the information that you have, knowing that there's no perfect solution out there. And that's, you have to think about the affordances and the constraints of any given platform. And we can certainly talk you through that. But, there's no perfect solution that's 100% free, right? So everything comes with some sort of cost. And so we can help you think through that, but it's tricky. Okay, with that, I'm going to move on to cover art because I want to make sure we have time to talk about and listen to some audio today. We haven't had a chance to do much of that in the series. Excuse me. So every podcast needs cover art, and that includes the show, the sort of branding of the show, and you can have individual cover art for individual episodes. And you'll need that for promotion, as well as to push it to those services. There are platforms out there that provide free templates. I really like Canva because Canva allows you to easily resize your digital assets. When I'm creating digital assets for events, I need 3 different sizes, one for the online calendar, one for the digital signage in the building, and one for the posters that we print out and put out in our space to promote our events. Canva allows me to do that pretty easily. Different hosting platforms have different pixel sizes, 800 by 800, 1400 by 1400. So you'll need to, once you pick that service, you need to sort of look at what they recommend. They'll guide you through it. They'll show you what you need. And if you do something like Canva, you can actually enter like, I need 800 pixels by 800 pixels, and it will size it for you, just like it would for Instagram or other kinds of things. What you can do is embed the cover art into the audio file. Now, if you're using one of these hosting platforms, you don't need to do this. You'll upload your audio file. It'll ask you for your cover art, all the other information and metadata that you need. It sort of does it all for you. You can also do it yourself using typically the ID, what's called an ID3 tag. ID3 is metadata for media. And I couldn't find what ID3 stands for. If anyone knows, please put it in the chat. If you're using Adobe Audition, you can add cover art in Adobe. You cannot do it in Audacity as far as I can tell. If you're in an Apple using a Mac, you can open your audio file up in iTunes and add it in iTunes. If you're in Windows, you might be able to do it in the Windows Media Player. I saw a little bit of chatter online about that. but you might have to download a platform for that. And there's lots of information out there about how to do that. Okay. And thanks, Rose is putting in the definition from Wikipedia about ID3 as a metadata container for MP3 audio file formats. Thank you so much. Let's talk a little bit about transcripts. And I'm sorry to be speeding up a little bit, but I want to make sure we have time to listen to some trailers. Okay. It's really important that we have transcripts for our audio files and that we don't think about accessibility as an afterthought, but we build that into our design and our project planning for our podcast. Several years ago, we had a group of students at our Winter Institute who made a whole podcast about transcription. And the first act in that episode was all about how to craft a good transcript. And so there's a link here if you want to read it or listen to it rather, to see things, the kinds of things you should be thinking about when you're designing a transcript. And I encourage you to think about transcripts as being designed and crafted and not just slapped together. Now, luckily, whatever you think about artificial intelligence, so-called, there are tools out there that can help produce a messy transcript. Zoom has, I think it's otter.ai is built into Zoom, and I'm right now doing automatic transcription of this video, which I'll go and clean up before I load it in this and the video into YouTube. A lot of folks use Otter AI as the standalone platform, or they might use Temi. You can even use YouTube. You can put audio into YouTube as long as there's at least one static image. You can use that to produce a transcript there as well. But just note that you're going to have to clean it up, right? AI is not optimized for all voices and for all speakers and for all accents. And so depending on the nature of your podcast, you might have more or less work to do. If your podcast is not in English, these tools may perform very differently. If you're doing a scripted podcast and you're just reading from your script, then you don't have to produce a transcript. You already have that script and you can transform it into a podcast. I'm sorry, into a transcript. So again, we want to think about transcription as a creative act and a scholarly act, and not just a sort of afterthought that we quickly dash off. So what makes for a good transcript? There's a lot of different things there that make for a good transcript. If you want someone to be able to sort of read along with audio playing, you're going to need timestamps. That's where you have, the minute, the hour, the minute, the seconds in brackets. And that allows the transcript to follow the audio. And if you're in something like YouTube, it syncs up so that you can actually read the transcript as the audio or the video plays. You want to make sure that your transcript is free of minimal errors. And I would encourage you to richly describe your soundscape because audio is actually a very visual medium. So you might want to provide background information, maybe bracketed about not just say background music, but maybe you provide the names of the songs or a description of the music or a description of sound effects or other things like that. And there's other things you can do too, but you want to think about sort of how you can rebuild that soundscape through text. Now, in terms of a format, it's going to kind of depend. So some people put their transcript directly in the website that they're using. Some just link out to a standalone transcript that might be a Word doc or a Google Doc or a plain text file. Some people use PDF. There's no 100% perfect solution there either. I did want to show one. I'm going to come back to Sonocene a few times today, but if you look at this, this is produced by a former participant of our Podcasting Institute. Excuse me, if I click on one of these, here they have the audio embedded directly in the website and then the transcript with the timestamp. So as you play it, you can read along. You can't follow along. The transcript doesn't necessarily roll, but you can at least know, oh, here's this. Here they're describing the soundscape because this is a podcast all about soundscaping. And so this is a really good example of a very rich transcript. So you want to think about that. Okay, a couple other things, and then we're going to listen to some audio. You're also going to need show notes and some extra stuff. So show notes would be a brief description of the episode. You might have a broader description for the podcast itself, but each episode also needs show notes. You might have information about any guests you have, links to their sites, music credits, the production team credits, things like that. There are also lots of podcasters out there who are doing extras, photos, video. More people are beginning to use video in their podcasting, which seems counterintuitive because podcasting is an audio medium, but people are adding video to it. Or additional content for paying listeners, paying subscribers, ad-free streaming, behind the scenes content, cutting room floor material. And I'm ambivalent about this because, again, this is part of that monetization of podcasting, but also recognizing that podcasting takes labor. And if you want to have a team, you need to pay them for their labor, ideally a living wage, which requires funding. And so having a subscription model can allow for that kind of ethical labor. So I'm sort of two minds here. And a lot of these extras will live on your website or Patreon or somewhere else. And you sort of unlock it for the listeners who pay extra. And so if you think you're going to have some of these extras, you definitely want to have that website. And then you just have to think about how you're going to get people from the platform to the website. So often you'll hear in the promos or in the end credits, go to our website, blah, 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 to learn more. And so you need to think about those sort of crosswalks between the website and wherever people might be listening to their podcast. Okay. So in the time remaining, let's talk about promotion. And in particular, I want to talk about trailers. So many of you have probably heard podcast trailers. They're little teasers, often before an entire season drops. Or before the first episode of a season drops. And there's lots of different styles out there. So there's a very traditional one where you just sort of have a little narration like next on Faculty Futures Lab, and then you have a little excerpt of that conversation. Sometimes people might use outtakes to sort of be a teaser for the next week. But there's also more the kind of trailers where you can actually create new and additional content. So I'm going to play a couple examples. The first is a trailer for the Battle of the Green Fishes, which was produced at our 2023 Winter Institute by Andrew Craig, Carrington O'Brien, Morgan Schneider, and Kayla Shea. They did a two-part sort of trailer where they took excerpts from their actual podcast, and then during one of the things we do during the Institute is we pair up different cohorts with each other to get to know each other. They actually had me record their Zoom conversation with another cohort where they were talking about their podcast. And so they used that to produce new sound for their podcast, for their trailer rather. So I'm going to just play that real quick. Oops. And it's not. There we go.
It was a hot, humid September morning when we received the order to march toward the Rio Paraguay.
The sound of gunfire was deafening, and the smoke from the cannons filled the air.
The Battle of the Green Fishes was a defining moment in the history of naval warfare.
One of the biggest obstacles we face is a lack of knowledge and awareness about the war among the general public.
What are you guys working on? What's your podcast about?
Andrew, what is it about? Tell them. Tell the people.
We want to spoil it though?
Yeah, but the big question is, the more we tell you, the worse it is for you.
There are boats. I will say that much. There are boats.
There's layers of falsehood.
But most concerning is that there's a monster with 3 eyes.
Yes, is there ever a real answer in the humanities or just more questions?
You choose to listen, you're entering the competition.
Do you guys want to know?
I don't know if I want to know.
Feeling confused yet?
Yes. Yes, but intrigued at the same time.
I think you'll be satisfied at the end.
From the National Humanities Center Podcasting Institute, it's the Battle of the Green Fishes. One historical mystery, unlimited perspectives. I'm Carrington O'Brien.
I'm Kayla Shea.
I'm Morgan Schneider.
And I'm Andrew Craig.
I think you're gonna fall hook, line, sinker.
So I love this trailer for so many reasons. It
was a hot, humid September morning.
That autoplayed I should have turned that off. Anyway, I love this trailer because it's really compelling. So it's got some plays on words. It's got really good soundscaping. It's got a little bit of an excerpt to sort of hook you in. And then it's all about this mystery, and it's sort of building this mystery. And it's like, I have to know what the Battle of the Green Fishes is. I have to know what this mystery is. And so it really makes you want to listen. So it's very well produced. It's not terribly long, and it's really compelling. Now, another trailer that I really want to play for you is the sauna scene. This is Konstantin Vlasis is I think a music or musicology grad student at NYU. He has a grant from New York, the New York Humanities Council, I think, and NYU, and he's gotten a team together to produce this podcast called the Sauna Scene. And I started listening to his trailer, and I'm listening to it on repeat. I cannot stop listening to this trailer. This is an amazing example of soundscaping. And this podcast is all about sound and storytelling and ecological stories. So I'm going to just play it and have you just listen to it and sort of absorb that.
What is the soundscape of New York City?
I love that sound, that feeling.
And listen to them through the sound experience.
Love the sound of cutting fabric.
Attune yourself to the entire environment.
Ecological relationships.
Ecological issues.
Ecological is more than just like
soil
where it's being grown.
can soil absorbing carbon. The water in the coastline.
The planet.
They don't want to feel helpless, and they want to feel
feeling of hopelessness. Not yet decided.
The frequencies that are
But when you're riding a bicycle,
microplastics. They're all around.
They're all kind of chemical.
Listen.
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 Listen
to my voice.
Listen to my voice.
Listen to my voice.
Listen to my voice.
To spoken words and
ambient sounds.
And ambient sounds.
Together, they tell a story about people
and place.
About plants
and animals.
The animals. Those are the voices I hear.
About the ecological relationships within New York City.
During a time of rapid change.
And the way they all resonate as an interwoven network of vibrations.
Welcome to the Sauna Scene.
Ecological stories told through sound.
So I think some of you can understand why I'm so drawn to this this trailer. It is such an amazing piece of mixing and soundscaping. And it's fitting for the topic of the podcast that's all about soundscapes and ecological stories told through sound. And it's very clear to me listening to it, and I've listened to it about a dozen times already, and I'm going to keep listening to it. What they did, each episode features a different person that they're interviewing around the city, but they had each one, when they were record a similar script for that trailer. And that suggests to me that the trailer had been sort of partially pre-designed when they started to do this, right? So they had at least some of this already thought through, and some of it is excerpts that they pulled from the individual episodes. And so what's so powerful about this is the way they've layered the sound, have people speaking even at the same pace, that layering, and it makes sense for that trailer. Now that must have taken a lot of work, both to design the trailer, then to record it, and then to go through the actual episodes and pull out some excerpts. And that must have been the last thing that they created, because they would have needed to have enough sound bites from the individual episodes. So just like your transcript, the trailer is something you need to also think through and design and craft. In our Podcasting Institute, in the old days, back in 2019 and 2020, we used to actually sit together on the last day of the week and listen to each other's podcasts. And that was fine when we were a very small group, but now that we're as big as we are, we don't have time to listen to 20 or so podcasts. So we've been asking our students to produce a trailer. Some groups don't have time, and they just take we ask them for 5 minutes, which is kind of long for a trailer, but we ask them to just pick 5-minute excerpt. But others, like the Battle of the Green Fishes team, actually take the time, or have the time, I should say, to craft a trailer. Sometimes, you might not know exactly what the trailer is going to sound like when you're getting started, but as you're recording, sounds will jump out at you and you'll start to say, oh, this might be a great promo sound, or this little standalone bit here is a nice little teaser. So you want to be thinking about that, and maybe have your promotional text or your intro text, your episode ready to go, or to the broader show, so that you can do that kind of recording while you could be thinking about that bigger picture promotion while you're actually creating an episode. Optimal length for a trailer depends. A lot of the ones I'm seeing are shorter, but I've seen some as long as 5 minutes, and it depends on what you're trying to do with it, and how you're using it. So there are tools out there that can help you produce a trailer, including video if you want video to push out to social media. But frankly, I think most of our folks just put their audio editing skills to work in their preferred editing software and do it there. It's all about sort of thinking about how to design that. And then thinking about your audience. We've talked a lot about this even in the first workshop. You might want a very small audience. Maybe you're working on a podcast with in community with some folks, and that's all you care about reaching. That's totally fine, right? But if you're trying to reach broader audience or reach beyond your intended audience, you'll need to think about that. And the trailer, again, and the cover art that can help you. Those are things that are sort of social media ready that you can push out across all the platforms. And just like with podcasting, there's this like proliferation and almost like splintering of podcast hosting solutions. Social media is sort of that's happening a little bit, with the demise of Twitter. If you're at an institution, certainly want to reach out to your department, college, or university communications team to help you promote it, if for no other reason, to showcase the research and creative activity of the institution. Schools always want to do this. And as long as the people who are involved in the production of your podcast, as well as any guests that you bring on, as long as they all consent to that, it's a great way to get it out there and get some attention, and really establish it as scholarly and creative activity. If you're trying to make it really, really, really big, one thing that people recommend is that you take an episode and maybe you put all your energy into making that 1 or 2 episodes, and you pitch it to an established show. So if you listen to some of the larger podcasts, sometimes you'll hear these crossover episodes where they'll promote another podcast, and you can do that as well. If you're going to do that, you have to be prepared to hit it big. So if you've got a podcast and you've got sort of a leisurely production schedule, if you suddenly make it big, how are you going to manage your success? And so you need to think through that as well. And again, we emphasize this in our institute, small is good. You don't have to hit 10,000 listeners, right? It's finding the right people for that story. There are now some podcast networks. There's the Amplify Podcast Network, which is establishing processes for peer review of podcasts. You can always apply to submit your podcast to them. And there's other things too. There's radio collectives and things like that. So you can always plug into an existing network. Again, it depends on who you're trying to reach and for what purposes. So with that, we're going to just mention a few quick things and then see if there are any last questions. So we have one workshop left next week, which is all about if you want to teach podcasting, if you want your students to engage in podcasting as a learning opportunity. We're going to talk about different approaches to incorporating podcast into your teaching. And again, I'll be filming it. It'll go up on YouTube if you can't make it in real time. These resources will persist in that tiny URL for as long as we're able to keep them going. And so you can always grab that stuff and download it. I'm putting those links back into the chat one more time. Our YouTube channel will have the processed video and the roughly cleaned up transcript. There's a feedback form. If you're not going to come to the last workshop and you're only going to do these first 4, please fill out that feedback form. Let us know how we did, ideas for future workshops. And as I say, our team is here for you. Patrick and I are available. Those are our email addresses. You can always reach out to us with specific questions for anything we covered in these workshops or anything we didn't cover that you want to learn more about. So with that, I'm going to actually stop the recording, but see if there are any last questions. I hope you have a lovely weekend, and I thank you for joining us. Now I just have to find, sorry, I can't find my controls. There we go.